Hi everyone, and welcome to Brain Fruits, the podcast from women changemakers. You can listen to Brain Fruits on all major streaming platforms: Apple Podcast, YouTube, and Spotify. I'm your host, Hannah Becker, and today I have the great pleasure to introduce you to
Elinor Samuelsson, founder of BrightAct, a company that uses thoughtful tech to address domestic violence globally.
Elinor, you have worked as an interaction designer, co-founded Cocoon, a stress-resilient technology for offices using sensory design, and are now founding BrightAct. Can you tell us about your startup story?
Yes, and thank you so much for having me, Hannah. My startup story has basically started since I was young. I've always been very driven by creating things. I've always been very driven by creating tech for good. So technology that has a positive impact on society. I have a long history of building companies in various forms. I started my first one when I was 15, where we were selling earplugs at concerts, and we had a really good margin. We bought them for 1 krona, we sold them for 25, and so that's where I learned the aspects of driving a profitable company with quite minimal effort. And then from there, I've just been driven to do whatever calls me, whatever I find interesting, and whatever I think the world needs, paired up with my skills.
This sounds so inspirational, especially already starting, at the age of 15 is a pretty young age. You have now worked as an interaction designer, co-founded Cocoon, a stress resilience technology for offices using sensory design, and are now founding BrightAct. Can you tell us what BrightAct is about?
BrightAct is thoughtful technology to break the cycle of domestic violence globally. We work with the Sustainable Development Goals and user-driven innovation to understand domestic violence with a data-driven model. We're building apps for inhabitants to gather all support in one place that's easy and user-friendly to find, and also helps you wherever you are in the world, whenever you need it. And then those apps connect to a platform for the public sector, for academia, for NGOs, so they can better plan their resources and help those in need. So that's in short what BrightAct is doing. It's like an ecosystem of a social security safety net.
Wow, that sounds really, really important. I mean, we know that this comes, I think, from the WHO, that about 1 in 3 women worldwide have been subject to either physical or sexual intimate partner violence. That's a really high number. What is the role of technology in facilitating and tackling domestic abuse?
Yeah, you're right. That number was also very shocking to me. The role of technology here is that the cycle of violence is actually very predictable. It typically follows a similar cycle with a similar course of events that happen. And so we are using technology to understand those cycles. So technology is helpful in the sense to understand the help-seeking behavior of people. It's helpful to understand what type of violence that happens when, because right now there's hardly any data on this topic at all. It's also helpful to facilitate and streamline the pathways to help, and to make sure that you get the right resources when you need them, because right now everything is very fragmented across many different authorities and organizations. And if you're seeking help while your brain is in a stress state, and we know we go back to our primal brain when we are in a stress state, it can be challenging to make decisions and also know where to turn. So we're also using technology for that kind of support.
That is really interesting, especially that there is no data so far on domestic abuse. So we talked a little bit now about technology that can help us to collect data on victims particularly. But when we look at it from the other side, we can also see that technology sometimes seems as an enabling factor for domestic abuse. And I'm talking here about partners trying to monitor what their victims are doing during their day, trying to maintain control, often via phones. What's your stake on technology as a facilitator for domestic abuse?
Technology is just a medium, so it depends on the intention behind it, and it depends on how it's being used. So we're actually not tracking individuals in any way. We are only looking at anonymous aggregated data. You are right that there are many ways that partners can be very controlling in these kind of like relationships. And usually like victims say that the violence itself is bad, but it's almost this like fear of like violence and having your rights taken away from you. That's very hard. But we are looking into ways of like empowering those subjected to like domestic violence to be aware of how they can protect themselves.
This awareness around this topic is something that is coming up as a quite new topic. And of course, when we talk about awareness, people often ask for data. How can we imagine that BrightAct is using data, and how does it collect data and make sense of it, turning it into meaningful preventive measures?
So what we are looking at is on a regional basis within like neighborhoods, like what types of violence that happen within that area, and who is it that is seeking help for it. And when I say who, I don't mean the specific individual. I mean more like, is it a man, is it a woman, is it a child, like, and how do they think of themselves? Because right now most of this like analysis is done by pen and paper, and it happens every 3 years, every 5 years, in some cases every 8 years. So there's not really much to base like decisions on. And now with COVID, where we've seen a spike in domestic violence, in some places there is a predicted increase of 20 to 40%. It's really hard for municipalities to know when the big wave of help seekers will come. That will imply that the public sector needs to put in extra resources. So that's what they're very curious to find out, like, when do we need to help our inhabitants, and with what? Like, what is it they need? So we are helping them to understand that.
That's super interesting. How can I imagine that? Is it then from like a public sector perspective that they get some sort of a platform or an app that tells them you might have to look into this and this zip code because there is a likelihood of people being exploited at the moment just due to some past data? Or how does it really look like?
It can be thought of a preventative technology where we're kind of the octopus arms that reaches out into society. We try to find individuals as early as possible, because right now only 40% talk to anyone. 5 to 10% reach out to authorities or like the public sector. So it's very few people that actually voice this issue at all. So we are trying to find very creative ways to find the individuals that need help, or individuals that know someone that might need help.
Let's say if I would have a friend that I know maybe is a likely victim of domestic abuse, what would I do?
So we have 2 things that we're going to launch shortly. So we have the BrightAct app that's also going to live as a web-based website, where we're building profile pages for all the organizations within the region that you live, so within your city. So you can find social services, you can find different help organizations, you can get access to the police. And then we're also co-developing a tool that's for the greater community, together with a bigger tech company called the Typeform, where we're creating this campaign called a Dear Neighbor. And it's an educational form that you like fill out to understand your how you would act in a like situation if you like suspected if someone was like subjected to domestic violence, and then you learn how to speak to that person, and then what kind of help is available to you.
I wouldn't actually know how to act if I would know that someone is maybe a victim of domestic abuse. So that would be very helpful for me as a friend to know, oh, how would I actually need to act, whom to call. We know that some of the risk factors that are more like the preliminary factors for intimate partner and sexual violence, they include like lower levels of education, a history of exposure to child maltreatment, or witnessing family violence. But it can also be things like low levels of women access to paid employment, or low levels of gender equality. How can we address these root causes?
Through like user-driven innovation and through like data. So one of the reasons why we're very curious into looking into many different areas of society, it's really to get a fuller picture of how they happen. My prediction is that it's probably going to take a like generation to get to a full understanding, because that's usually the cycle and the loop. And you are right that there are certain like risk factors that will create a higher like probability that you might become subjected like to domestic violence or become abusive. And I would say, from my still rather limited understanding, that it comes from your attachment like models, and what you've learned love is, and how you've learned to feel important at an early age, and how you actually manage your emotions, or the lack thereof. So it's rather interesting, and I think a lot of it also has to do with control, the sense of control, and a sense of familiarity. There are some studies that show that if you have grown up in a home with like abusive parents, then you're 7 times more likely to either find a like partner who is abusive, or become abusive yourself. So there are strong like correlations. And I'm glad that you also say that they are like risk factors, because we can't actually know who will be like a like victim or not, or who will be an abuser or not, because it could actually happen to anyone. Like, that's what's rather fascinating about this topic. And as a UX designer, I'm like, ooh, big problem to solve, because it's very much behavior based. But that's something that we are like looking into, and I think we're in an early stage of doing that, but it's something we're going to get more and more insight on the further along we come.
It's very interesting that you say that, like this behavior-based UX design, working a lot with mental models that we have as humans, depending on where we grew up, what our family was, what's our perception of the world around us, right? I can imagine that it's quite a difficult journey to reach certain population groups with UX design, because you have to almost like break through their mental models, right, to reach them. So I would like to know, what's the role of UX design when we talk about dealing with violence behavior patterns?
I would say the role of like UX design is to build a technology that's centered around human needs. And what I mean by that is not building technology that is overlapped over your life and now you have to like adjust to that, but actually building like technology based on what is it that you need. So we're always out like listening to all the different stakeholders about what the gaps are like within their lives and what they wish they had. And then from those patterns, we develop our like features and also the different like design. And we've chosen to build BrightAct in a very modular way since we are aiming to scale this globally. We know that different cultures look at things like differently, and what would work within Sweden might not work within Germany or within Spain or within like Estonia. So we try to be very mindful of being very flexible and also to be able to switch content or switch on and off functions depending on what people need. But the root of it is really just to build tech from the bottom up almost. So listening into what it is that people need. And there tend to be very distinct patterns.
Interesting.
That you find when you talk to your users.
It's very interesting, like this emphasizing process, I think, that you highlight here, which we can find in design thinking, which is really an interesting method by itself, right? That it can also be used not only in a pure business sense, but also to solve bigger societal issues. I would be very interested, Elinor, what's your problem-solving toolkit? What approaches do you use to design this good tech for solutions for society?
I always start with the why. So I look into what kind of impact is needed in the world. Like what is a really big problem that many people seem to have? What is a problem that general frameworks agree on is a big like problem? So I actually like looking at the UN like development goals and try to find something within there. If it's one goal or if it's, I don't know, 5, but something that is big. And I am personally very interested in wicked problems, which are problems that don't have a definite like solution. And I'm also very interested in how to evolve like consciousness. So my things that I work with tend to fall within those areas. And then what I do is really to start talking to people if I don't have a clear idea like myself yet. With BrightAct, we are really mapping out every single stakeholder there is, and then also across countries. So we have a group of, I think, 350 experts right now who are advising us in some ways for us to really be clever about how we build the technology early on so we don't miss anything. But I would do interviews, I would build very simple prototypes. Sometimes I would spend like 1 hour like mocking something up and then showing it to someone, and they will talk me through it, where they just get to speak about it from their first like impressions. And I usually tell them like don't worry about hurting my feelings. Like I would rather just have you give your honest like opinion, and like this is to help like address this issue. So really just feel free to just say whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, whatever you don't understand, whatever you think is good. And then they will click through the prototype and just openly talk. And then we will have this like discussion afterwards where they can also share if they had any more thoughts. And then I just do that. And I usually will test the prototype with maybe up to 5 people.
Okay.
Because then you start seeing most of the patterns. I don't think it brings so much value to do more than that if it's the same prototype. And then you take it back, you iterate it, and then you do it again. Like,
it sounds really agile to me, I must say, that you like go out and you try out one solution that you have, a minimum viable product, so to say, and then you present it to someone, right, in like a retrospective almost, in a review. And then after that, you go and see what worked and what didn't work. So I can see some toolkits here coming from design thinking and from working with sprints, maybe working in a Scrum methodology. Very, very intriguing that you mix these methods, and also say that you don't need to have such a big base in order to test. Like 5 people is enough and it works, right? That's really cool hints, because I think a lot of our listeners or people that think about maybe starting a company, it can always seem very big in the beginning, and especially when we come to talking about testing, I hear that a lot from some of my friends. They're like, oh, then I need to find this huge sample population of plus 500 people, right, to test my solution. Like, no.
It's almost like a science experiment. So you set up what are my biggest assumptions that would also be your biggest risks, because if you're assuming something, they might be wrong. So if you start building on wrong information, then your solution won't meet the needs. So you want to identify those. You want to identify who are the people who have this issue, who is the most likely person to have this, and then try to find 5 of these people. And then you create a hypotheses that you also can measure. And then you test it out, and you can spend very little time building just the shell of the prototype. It doesn't have to work, but you just have to give a realistic image of what it could be, so someone can give you feedback.
Getting a bit more personal, Elinor, what are some of the challenges that you encounter as a woman tech entrepreneur?
I have such an optimistic mindset, to be honest, that I don't really see challenges like that. I think working with this topic, we actually have quite a lot of women who are drawn to us naturally. So I think this is the first time in my whole career that I feel like I'm not the only woman within the team, because that's usually the case when I do my work. It's like a bunch of guys and then it's me, which I also like, but I do think there's something really beautiful about having many different kinds of perspectives and the great diversity within teams, because I think there's more potential to collect various viewpoints when you do that. And I think the products become more innovative.
Having heard about your inspiring story, what would be the recommendation, the brain fruits that you would like to pass on to our community of listeners?
I would say to do what makes you feel the most alive. Do what makes you feel happy. Because I think when you follow that path, that doesn't come from a must, or that doesn't necessarily come from an ego or from fear, but rather following what your heart wants and following what truly inspires you, that's where magic happens. And that's also where you're going to get the energy from, because if you do want to start a company, it's a lot of work. And I don't think that should be underestimated. And I think it's a lot more challenging to run a startup than what it is being employed, because you are 100% responsible for everything.
Tuning inwards and finding what makes you happy, where do you see your energy coming from, is exactly as you say, where the magic happens. So that's a really nice recommendation. Elinor, I would like to thank you for being part of the Brain Fruits podcast. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. Thank you for doing this. You're also such a light of inspiration.